request all of you to raise and repeat after me the preamble of the Constitution. We, the people of India, having solemnly resolved to constitute India into a sovereign, socialist, secular, democratic republic, and to secure to all its citizens justice, social, economic, and political liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith and worship, equality of status and of opportunity, and to promote among them all fraternity, assuring the dignity of the individual and the unity and integrity of the nation. In our Constituent Assembly, this 26th day of November 1949, do hereby adopt, enact, and give to ourselves this Constitution.
A very happy morning to all of you. So it's a great pleasure and privilege to me to be here and invite all of you for this celebration of India's Constitution. And as we know, we have completed 75 years and now we are into 76th year of adoption of our Indian Constitution, which is the foundation of the celebration of liberty, fraternity, and integrity. And if you look at that, the idea which we have under the Indian Constitution, and it clearly reflects in our preamble. And in preamble, when you look at that, in 1946, when Mr. Nehru has proposed about the objectives of the Constitution, then first time they have come up with how we should go about having an agenda for the post-independent India. As Daniel Austin mentioned, Constitution is the cornerstone of the nation and it is one of the unique features of the Indian Constitution. If you look at that in the preamble, it is always the soul and heart of the entire preamble. And we have studied and we are going to study that whether preamble is reflecting the true aspirations of the people of India. And that has been deliberated, discussed by various scholars and the Supreme Court decisions, and also they have continued to speak its relevance to today. Like yesterday we discussed the relevance of the Constitution and the relevance of its preamble, its ideas, how far we are going to remind ourselves to enjoy the freedom of India and the unity and diversity and also pluralistic ideologies of India. Now coming to the important aspect why we need to remind ourselves, because today we are experiencing several challenges. We are at the crossroads today, and now we need to decide and determine how we are going to take the Indian Constitution and its ideals. Now we have speakers. We are going to have another set of speakers today, and they are going to speak on very important topics in today. We have the four speakers, starting with Dr. Ajay Gudavarthy. He is Associate Professor of Political Science from the Department of Political Science, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and is been the one of the scholars who keeps writing on political issues of the country. And I take this opportunity to warmly welcome Dr. Ajay to the VIT School of Law and VIT University. Thank you, Dr. Ajay. Now we have Dr. Rinku Lampa. She is also Associate Professor of Political Science from the National School of India. She is one of the good researchers. She has been extensively written and traveled across the countries, and she speaks through her work about the political nature of our constitutionality and the ideals of the Indian Constitution and the aspirations of the people. I take this opportunity to welcome Dr. Rinku Lampa to the VIT University. Thank you. And he is a Professor of Political Science from the Jamia Millia Islamia University, New Delhi, and he is one of the senior most professors of the department, and is extensively writing the Indian political scenarios, and he keeps lecturing to the people on the various aspects of the political aspirations of the Indian masses, and he also worked on the area studies of the South Asia. And Dr. Raju, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and we will welcome you to VIT University. Thank you so much for your time. Now we have Dr. Saheb Chaudhary, who is Assistant Professor of Law at NLU Assam, and he is going to join us in online through Zoom, and he will be speaking to all of you in the evening of the post-one session, and is primarily going to focus upon where we are standing with regard to the health legislations of India is concerned and reflecting the ideologies of the Constitution. So this is today's program, and I welcome even Mr. Saheb Singh Chaudhary to the university and for this lecture series in his absentia. And today it is another important occasion for us to celebrate and remember the contributions made by the freedom fighters, and we have identified one, Mr. Chidera Lakshmana Rao is also known as a freedom fighter and is a social reformer in the parts of Telangana, that is Edukal village of Khammam district. And he is one of the strong supporters of the independent India, and he was born in 1924. Until 1997, when he demised, he was working for the ideals of the Constitution. He worked in the freedom fighting and also against the oppressive regime of the Nizam government in those days, in the combined Andhra Pradesh. And he also worked for 40 years in the newspapers, several leading newspapers such as Indian Express, Andhra Prabha, and also as a reporter to the Press Trust of India for almost 40 years. And he is a contemporary of Sardar Keshav Jadavapuram and also I.V. Vachali and other freedom fighters of United Andhra Pradesh. And we take this opportunity to remember his contribution and his ideas and ideologies. So his children, his son has proposed that we should remember and also conduct innovative lectures and establish a kind of innovate at the University School of Law. Hence, we are dedicating a lecture which is going to be delivered by Dr. Ajay, his memory and his contribution. Now I take this opportunity to thank all of you and all the resource people and the organizers for creating this momentous occasion to celebrate our ideologies of the Constitution. With this, now I welcome one of our students to introduce our guest of this morning, and we'll start listening to Dr. Ajay. Thank you so much.
So before we start the session, let me request all the guests to come on the stage so that we can have a group photo with the Constitution. I also welcome the coordinators also.
Good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to have today's section. Dr. Ajay Gudavarthy, Associate Professor, Center for Political Science, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Dr. Ajay Gudavarthy is an associate and at the Center of Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and prominent political theorist, analyst, and columnist in India. He earned his PhD in 2002 from the Center of Political Science, Jawaharlal Nehru University, under the supervision of Professor Gudavarthy. His doctoral research taken fragmentation and solidarity, a study of caste, class, and gender movements in Andhra Pradesh, examined the interface of social and political movements through the lens of critical theory and post-Marxism. Professor Gudavarthy began his teaching career at the National University of Judicial Science, Calcutta 2001 to 2003, followed by a tenure at the National Law School of India University, Bangalore 2003 to 2006. He joined JNU in 2006 and has since been actively engaged in research, teaching and mentoring doctoral candidates. He has held prestigious visiting fellowship and faculty position internationally, include as Charles Wallis Fellow at SOAS, University of London 2008, visiting fellow at Goldsmith College, University of London 2010. Visiting faculty at the Center for Human Rights, University of Hyderabad 2011, and visiting fellow at the Center for Citizenship, Civil Society and Rule of Law, University of Aberdeen 2012. Professor Gudavarthy's scholarship critically engages with contemporary Indian politics, exploring the dynamics of social movements, state power, democratic theory, and question of caste, gender, and class. He is widely recognized for bridging rigorous critical analysis with practical insight in Indian civil society and political discourse, and requested Dr. Ajay Gudavarthy to kindly come to the dais and share his thoughts. Thank you.
So thank you to the young friend for that long introduction. It was almost began to sound like my obituary. It was too detailed, the kind of details she was going into. So thanks for that. And I should also thank my good friend Banerjee for this lovely invite. I think we are catching up after a long time. We had good times in JNU, and then we are now here meeting, I don't know, after a decade or so, I think. So let me begin by, unfortunately I do not know much about the person about whom I am giving this endowment. I have learned from Banerjee that he was a freedom fighter in Khammam area, so I am sure he is influenced by the left politics. Khammam is known for that. So I would be happy to meet his son if he is still around. Banerjee, I would be happy to kind of engage and meet him during tea. So the topic I chose really, speaks to the occasion. That we've been talking about constitution. I'm sure you had interesting deliberations yesterday, and you have the preamble here. We had the ceremonial salute of the preamble, but constitutionally, students of law, all of you need to be aware of this. That you might those, but constitutional democracies all over the world, whether you take United States, whether you take Brazil, whether you take Turkey, whether you take India, they're all under stress. The constitutions are being increasingly seen. The social contract that was formed for democracy around constitutions stand almost rejected, and there is a very decisive shift in democracies towards broadly what is referred to as populist authoritarian regimes. That these are extra institutional mobilization. People are going against rule of law, the sensibilities of separation of powers. These are seen more as custodians of elite interests, and constitutional vision are somehow stopped selling the story of being transformative. So in one sense, the crisis of constitutions across globe is that both social elites, middle class, as well as the underprivileged, both sections, both ends of the spectrum seems to have lost their trust in constitutions and constitutional vision and its ability to deliver social justice. So this is a deep question that really should engage all of you, because you are the guys who will be at the facing the music in coming decades, and you can see the erosion of democratic institutions, erosion of democratic procedures in India. Already almost all of constitutional bodies are under stress. We have been increasingly learning that constitutional posts are no longer neutral, they're increasingly biased, things of that kind. So one can clearly witness this democratic backsliding in the Indian context also. And the only way to kind of retrieve it seems to be to reinstill some new faith in constitutions or constitutional vision. The question we need to therefore, to do that, we need to know why are constitutional regimes and constitutional democracies in this kind of a stress? Why have constitutions become overnight documents that do not seem to hold the kind of transformative potential that they did at the time of independence? So if you come to the Indian case, even as a constitution in the post-independent era, there were two narratives. So I will share with you some of the details of these two narratives and then raise a series of questions. So and these are the questions to which I don't have answers, but I'll expect some of you young budding lawyers to come up with some interesting answers as to what can possibly explain the constitutional crisis. The two narratives in the immediate post-independence period was this, that one narrative was that constitution indeed was an elite document. It was not, it was prepared by a constituent assembly that did not have sufficient representation, and it was created by elites, highly English educated, middle class, professional lawyers, experts, so on and so forth. Right? The other narrative, which is more recent in literature, I will introduce you some of the recent writings, which begin by arguing that constitution do belong to the popular imagination in India, that there was a mass participation and mass involvement in the making of constitution and in imagining the constitutional social vision. So those are the two very contrasting narratives we have had in the post-independence period. The reality seems to lie somewhere in between. And somewhere we need to deduce these two contrasting narratives, the kind of contrast they set up, perhaps will give us some clues to the kind of constitutional crisis we are witnessing today. So we'll have to frame some fresh questions, both in terms of social theory and political theory, to understand the nature of this constitution. Even before we resolve, we actually need to first make effort to understand the nature of this constitutional crisis, and I don't think we fully understand it. that why is constitutional vision being rejected from both ends of the spectrum, both by the social elites who have benefited, enjoyed a certain social mobility, like the Hindu caste elites in Indian context, and those at the bottom end of the spectrum. Why is that even they have lost and they are more now seem to be invested in street mobilization, extra institutional mobilization, in violating procedural niceties, so on and so forth. So if you look one case study, the trust on judiciary, trust on policing institutions in India. And there was a recent study done by Ajay University, and it's abysmally low. The trust in democratic and constitutional institutions is very low compared to all other democratic countries. Why is this so? So if I go through the two narratives, the first narrative which says that Constitution was an elite enterprise. One of the reasons, Granville Austin makes a very interesting observation in his book, Indian Constitution, the Cornerstone, where he makes this, given the property, tax and educational requirement, Austin estimated that merely 28.5% of adult population was able to vote in the 1946 elections. So the first point is that, was the Constituent Assembly fairly represented? How wide was the voting percentage which elected these members who later elected the members of Constituent Assembly? That's the first question. So what was the nature of political participation that got, and political identities that got reflected in the making of the Constitution? Second important point to buttress this argument that it's a colonial document is that the institutions of the colonial government, the police, the army, the judiciary and the district administration continued largely unchanged. We simply borrowed the colonial administrative structure. So if you look at our police, and I think it becomes fairly evident that the colonial attitude that the police had during the British rule continued in the post-colonial era. That you walk into any police station today with the smallest of crime to be reported, you know what is the attitude of the policeman sitting in the police station. That he doesn't treat you like a citizen. First he will treat the person who has come to lodge a complaint as the criminal. First he will start suspecting you. That why did you come? I'll tell you, give you an anecdote. Once my father lost his mobile phone. So I took him to a police station, saying that we've lodged a complaint. So all we wanted to do is to lodge an FIR, because many of us know that nothing happens with these cases. You lose a mobile phone, you have lost it. Rarely I've heard a case where police will get you back that mobile phone. So, but law needed it, and as a precautionary measure that the cell phone is not to be misused, we walked in and so we met the first constable sitting in Hyderabad, commissioner's office, and said, look, please, we lost my. So the constable said, so what should I do? Take my mobile phone, take it, come, take it. This was his first response. There was no provocation. We were polite. All we wanted is, please register an FIR. So he was shoving his phone. My father was in a state of shock. I was doubling up. I was laughing. I said, what is this behavior? We have come, this is a regular job. He said, many people lose many things. So are we sitting here to search all your things? And in a very crude Telugu, he was responding. I said, yes, that is precisely why you are being paid. He said, okay, somebody will come, I lost purse. So where can we search? This is not our job. So he was talking very rudely, he was dismissive, and he was refusing to take the FIR. The only thing that works in Indian context is contacts. So we were compelled. We wanted to go because my father taught in Hyderabad for 50 years. Almost all senior IAS and IPS officers are his direct or indirect students. And the commissioner was his student. He didn't want to go and drop a name. He wanted regular procedure, please register. He said no. Then I had to do the inevitable, I called someone and the call came. Then he stood up. Sir, you should tell me. First, why did you tell? I said, what is there to tell? We have come as regulars, why should we drop a name? Chester Bernard makes a very interesting comment about Indian bureaucracy. He says it's a public jungle and a private paradise. Bureaucrats behave like they're in a jungle in the public, but if you know them in the private, it's a paradise. Things move so smoothly. The moment he got a call from someone, this guy sat down, gave us tea, gave us coffee, registered a FIR and came and saw us till our car. This should have been. So why does this happen? This happens because this was the colonial gaze. That he continues to think of us not as citizens, but as subjects. Like just as the colonial regime thought. So the second important question is that did the constitution making process in the way it envisaged the institutional framework of India, did it really break that colonial gaze on its subjects? So one of the strong arguments that some of the post-colonial scholars, some of the, those who read against the grain argue is that most of our institutions, whether it is the civil administration, whether it's a judiciary, whether it's a police service, they continue to have a colonial gaze institutionalized in their operative logic. Therefore, constitution remains essentially a colonial document. Third very interesting argument is that constitution is essentially not a civil but a war document. Some of the legal scholars have argued that we should recollect that constitution was made as India was witnessing partition. And therefore, constitution making itself was under circumstances which were not normal, which were not regular. That there was kind of a civil war kind of a situation in India. So most of the provisions, whether it is emergency powers, whether it is unitary features, whether it's extraordinary laws, and that continuity we could see in the post-independence period, that in India we have had series of legislations of extraordinary laws, beginning with TADA to POTA to UAP. And you can see most of these extraordinary laws are continuously used not against terrorism and crime, but against regular dissent in democracy. Most of those cases that you today see of social activists, well-meaning social activists, whether it is your Bhima Koregaon case or whether it's your Delhi riots case, these are all well-meaning social activists put behind bars under UAP emergency provisions, where they are behind bars without bail and without trial. So where does this come from? This is again borrowed from the way the British Empire treated its colonial subjects, and therefore you continue to have the same attitude in the administration of legislating, series of extraordinary laws, declaring many of the provisions, whether it is the northeast of India or whether it is Kashmir, as disturbed areas where they are governed through exceptionalism. So those are some of the arguments to say that Constitution really did not break this kind of a colonial imagination in the running of democratic institutions in post-independent. The contrary argument that some of the more recent scholarship has made is to argue that Constitution did envisage itself as a very transformative document. And if you look at again, you should all read Grenville Austin very closely. Grenville Austin very clearly says that Indian constitution making was framed through the philosophy of social revolution. That one single philosophy that was the guiding principle of Indian constitution making process was this imagination of social revolution that Dr. Ambedkar refers to. That to transform to the principles of equality, liberty, fraternity, so on and so forth. They were the guiding principles. Question as preamble you read, the concept of justice is so central to the imagination and making of the constitution. Therefore, the alternative reading would tell you that constitutional vision of social revolution was all about breaking traditional social hierarchies of caste, class and gender on one end and the colonial domination on the other end in terms of the relation between the governed and the governed. So this imagination of social revolution really did set in a transformative social process. So one quick example that we take is the policy of affirmative action. Positive discrimination is one principle. If you take, you can see imagine the nature of social change that this one principle brought in breaking Indian notions of rigid caste hierarchies, notions of caste discrimination. So the alternative reading of Constitution is really about social revolution. That Constitution, Indian Constitution really did contribute to the bringing of social revolution. More recent literature, I would refer you to Rohit Day's book, People's Constitution. Should all as young budding lawyers read this very lucid, with lot of anecdotes, very interesting anecdote, where Rohit Day makes a very interesting claim. The constitution making process itself was not limited to legal experts. That there was a kind of a mass involvement of the subaltern masses. Everyday vendors, he takes example of vendors, prostitutes, Muslims coming from across the border, Hindus who came from across the border, everyday people wanting to have citizenship. And Rohit Day's broad claim is that it is their continuous petitioning to the Constituent Assembly, bringing alive certain everyday issues that kind of had a lasting impact in the way Constituent Assembly worked and made some of the provisions. So this, I think, is a very contrary kind of a reading to say that Constituent Assembly or constitution making process was not one behind closed doors. It was not just the role of experts. It was not merely a technical exercise. It was a social and a deeply political exercise that did imagine the involvement of everyday common citizens. So people could begin to kind of petition and bring in new, as he gives this example of street vendors who wanted to continue to use. How would they do that? What kind of new law? So people suggested, people wrote letters, people gave petitions, and a more recent study by Ornit Shani, an Israeli scholar who did, they've again, Rohit and Shani have just come out with a new book. But Ornit Shani's earlier work also reflects this idea that, she argues that there's a continuous engagement of wider public social organizations which made Constitution part of popular Indian imagination. So this idea that we have that Constitution is part of an elite exercise behind closed doors, which was all about technical exercise, Chani goes through some primary sources and to argue that it was rejected that Constitution was to be made by experts. She argues that this idea was rejected right in the beginning. People began to take, constitution makers in the Constituent Assembly began to take these petitions and letters very seriously. Though she does add a caveat that she says, we do not know exactly in what form these letters walk into making of constitutional provisions. But she takes a wild guess that because they were continuously reading these petitions, there was an awareness of the Constituent Assembly makers of this petition, nature of demands that was coming in, like on the language question, like letters from the Northeast. It was very interesting to read those details that they were continuously being made aware. And somewhere says that Rajendra Prasad did say that we should take these letters seriously, and he did disperse some of them to those respective committees. So this again gives the idea that Constitution, the basic argument, both Rohit and Arvind Shani says that Constitution is part of popular everyday imagination of common people. This is a question we'll come back to. That how true is this claim? Because this is a very radical claim that they are making, to say that common people were not only aware of the constitution making process, but they are fashioning their everyday demands in the imagination of the constitution. How wide scale was this exercise? Are they really plucking out things, exaggerating? Because some of these instances that Rohit gives of a prostitute, of a street vendor, are not a regular examples. These are slightly offbeat examples. So how true is to say even today, and this question becomes doubly important because today, Indian democratic context, how much do we think is Constitution really part of popular imagination today? Do common people on the streets talk about Constitution? Do common people believe that they have earned certain inalienable rights because India is a constitutional democracy? Do they really believe that they can approach judiciary, therefore because our even elected representatives are constrained by the provisions given in the constitution? This very elementary aspect of a constitutional democracy, how far is its reach? I would suggest to Ben that you should get your students to do a study in and around. Now we are doing one such study in Delhi. Somebody from Karnataka, some MP requested us to do this study. Congress MP, that how in-depth is the reach of the imagination of the constitution. People may not know the exact provisions. People may not know objective revolution. People may not know what is a preamble. That's not how it works in popular imagination. But people would have this imagination. Constitution is a document that empowers us with certain inalienable rights, like life, right to property, right to liberty, right to freedom of expression. Is this really part of our popular imagination in India? If you go by this contrary literature, it looks as if constitution making itself was so much. That's why the title of Rohit's book is People's Constitution. This is something we will remember. I'll come back to when I raise my series of questions that I would want you guys to take up. My third example is a very interesting sociologist, Nandini Sundar, a good friend of ours in Delhi School, in her work on Naxalite movement. She makes this very interesting point that there was this Pathalgadi movement in Chhattisgarh among the tribals. Some of you might know, those who have studied tribal questions, those who might be teaching on the Schedule 6, Schedule 7 on PESA and other related legislations would perhaps know this history, that when Pathalgadi movement was started by the tribals in Chhattisgarh, what they did was to place stones. Pathalgadi is to literally, in Chhattisgarhi language, it means to locate stones, to say, to demarcate a territory that they declared to themselves to be sovereign and self-governed. And the most interesting aspect of this was that this movement was being run by the tribal chieftains in Chhattisgarh in the name of constitution. It says that constitution recognizes our right to self-governance, and therefore you cannot have external legislations being imposed on us. So this is another interesting case at the one end of the extreme end of the spectrum, to say that even those dissenters who would in one sense question the sovereignty of the state were also doing it in the name of constitution. So in other words, the elasticity of the social imagination of the constitution, because of its philosophy of social revolution, in some sense is so deep and has taken such deep social roots in India that even dissenters who question the sovereignty of the state do it in the name of constitution. So Nandini Sundar goes on to argue, she makes this point that along these lines of that Indian constitution, where tribals began to say, and she goes back in history, to Jagpal Singh and the tribal leaders during the constitution making process, where they had a stake in the constitution making process, and they said that we tribals, then indigenous communities, will teach you what democracy means. That is what they said to the caste Hindu experts on the constitution making. And the constitution making process allowed for that kind of a dialogue. That the tribal representatives like Jagpal Singh, who were in the part of the constitution making process, they laid this emphasis that indigenous communities, their traditional practices will teach the mainstream Hindu society what democracy actually means, because they had better gender relations, they were non-hierarchical, so on and so forth. So in one sense, the Nandini Sundar argues constitution making process reflected that kind of a social sensibility, that kind of an egalitarian sensibility to allow the most dissenting of voices to find an expression in the constitution making process. So that those are the two extreme ends we can see, both from certain vantage point look valid. that fact that Indian Constitution was made with social revolution as its philosophy, to offer us radical affirmative action policies, to offer special provisions for tribal areas, to offer directive principles, land reforms, you name it. Indian Constitution has it. But it's also true that the institutional functioning in the post-independence period, when you look around, they look extremely colonial, they look extremely discriminatory, and it looks as if constitutional process seems to have hardly had any impact on the nature of social practices that exist in it. Which is not uncommon for us to hear of a Dalit being lynched for getting onto the back of a horse. We heard of somebody pissing on a tribal. Most ugliest of social acts are still the most common of social facts in the Indian context. When you look from this end, it looks like constitution is almost an irrelevant document. That your functioning of institutional functioning, whether it is police, and if you take the representative structure of judiciary, somebody did a count recently. 76 families which began in the pre-independence period are the same families which continue to represent. There are hardly any Dalits, there are hardly any OBCs in the judiciary. So how do we, in one sense, how do we make sense of this paradox? That's my first question to all of you. And you guys need to be invested in this. And then the follow-up question is it this paradox that is at the heart of the constitutional crisis we are facing? And that, I think, is also impacting our current context. The nature of questions which we are facing in the current context, especially the last 10 years, since we have had a fairly conservative far-right-wing government, which does not particularly believe in a constitutional frame, these questions become doubly important. Let me raise my first question. If it is an elite document, if it's really a colonial document, what will explain the fact that far right-wing groups in India wish to sabotage such constitution? That's at one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum question could be, but if Indian constitution is part of popular Indian imagination and represents subaltern voices, what then explains the fact that a campaign like Samvidhan Bachao does not resonate with the common people in India? So you can see this paradox, how it works in very strange ways. That if it's merely a colonial document, then right-wing groups should actually adopt the constitution, should be happy with this constitution. But all conservative social forces in India are somewhere deeply troubled with the vision of social philosophy in Indian constitution. Therefore, there have been repeated attempts in the post-independence period to revise, to sabotage, and even to abandon the Indian constitution. And that project, I still believe, is still on, that we are not done with it, that this project of abandoning the Indian constitution and its social vision of social philosophy in terms of equality between castes, genders, tribes, religious denominations is deeply at the heart of why right-wing social groups reject Indian constitution. So what happens to the claim that it's a colonial document? But the paradox on the other end of the spectrum is that doesn't mean that we can quickly jump and say, no, then Indian constitution, the kind of claim some of these writers have made, that it's part of popular imagination, Indian imagination is part of. If that were true, then any attempt to sabotage Indian constitution should have had some mass resistance, and we really do not find that kind of a resistance. Samvidhan Bachao slogan is almost a non-starter in the Indian context, except by a fluke that in 2024, you got this response because people feared that reservations will be done away. It's not the constitution, the threat to constitution. So how much can threat to constitution really be a popular electoral issue in this country? Hardly. Banerjee will be troubled if constitution is sabotaged. But how many on the streets who go to elect Tomorrow some parties to go for an election fray and say that our job is to protect constitution, which is what Congress is doing. But you can see state after state they are failing. People don't respond to this idea to protect constitution. Even though constitution is known by Dr. Ambedkar, it does not really, bring that kind of a imagination. My second question is this a failure more because, again, this is where the right-wing critique comes and which we perhaps need to open up, is that constitution is not sufficiently grounded in the cultural imagination of this land. The cultural identity formation, the way people culturally self-represent themselves through religious, cultural identities, is not, which is where the practical consciousness, the pragmatic consciousness, the common sense operates. This is not something the constitution really reflects. So what is the equation between constitution and culture becomes an extremely important question. That why is it that, and this is a global crisis, that why is it that constitutional documents are more known by their social and political philosophy, but what do constitutions mean in terms of their cultural sensibilities? That is also the reason why right-wing groups are fairly successful when they come with this campaign that constitutions are borrowed documents. And yesterday you saw Prime Minister Modi also saying we are Macula's children, that there is an English-speaking elite in this country, and he says that his job is to liberate this country from this English slavery. Of course, Macaulay did say that he wanted Indians in blood, but English by values, training and ethics. This is what Macaulay's statement was. So it is true that English education does bring in certain kind of quote-unquote Western notions. So there is that colonial sensibility attached to English language and therefore attached to, by default, to constitutional imagination. Does that mean, so what does it actually mean? I mean, this is a question we need to wedge open today to understand. What does it actually mean to make a constitution belong to their cultural locationality? That is why today we have a new discourse of what is called as a civilizational state. Right-wing groups are today arguing that India is not run by a certain constitutional imagination that has a 200-year history, but Indian history goes back 5,000 years. There is a civilizational ethic or civilizational ethics that exist that are reflecting part of our myths, our mythologies, our deep cultural memory, which is more authentic to this land than a borrowed constitutional vision. So this again I think is a deeply troubling question, because which Ambedkar did point out when he said that constitutional morality in India does not exist, but it has to be constructed. So when constitution is based on the basis of constitutional morality, but the constitution maker himself suggests that that constitutional morality does not belong, is not readily available, it is not organic, but it is something to be constructed out of a political project. Does it not then mean that constitution is therefore not an organic document that belongs to this land? That means constitution does not belong to the mythological, mythical, cultural imagination of this land. Therefore, would it not be true in this sense to therefore argue that constitutional vision is something that we are importing from outside? Therefore, somebody can come and say very easily that human rights is an alien concept in the Indian context. That we don't need the language of rights, we need the language of samarasana. We need the language of harmony and not the language of rights. Which is true, that is not part of the cultural imagination. In fact, in Ashwani's book, he says, very concept of freedom, he says, is never there in the Indian intellectual tradition. In fact, argues Ambedkar was the first one to introduce this radical notion of freedom. So how do we understand this very uncomfortable space where we are invested in certain modern, liberal, transformative, sensibilities, but we realize that they don't really come from our history. One way to argue obviously is that there is a counter history like Pramila Thapar's, there's a shamanic history, there's a Bhakti tradition, and Bhakti movement did have this counter culture. And there were counter cultures that existed on the ground. That could be one way we can resolve this debate. But even then, that does not settle the question that his constitution of course did not emerge from those sensibilities. Constitution was brought through experts, through deliberation, through English language, through certain liberal normative imagination. How do we then settle this question, or how do we kind of counter this campaign that is going on that constitution is a borrowed document? I think part of it, Dr. Ambedkar being the kind of a prescient philosopher that he was, that he did preempt some of this. I think his later turn to Buddhism was an attempt to bring constitutional imagination and certain dimensions of spirituality together. So one can again go back to this question that can a certain cultural spiritual imagination be conjoined and imagined with modern constitution? If so, what would be the new narrative that we have to really pitch to, to come out of this deep constitutional crisis that nations are witnessing, especially in the Indian context? That do we need a new language of spiritual constitutionalism, where we can link our own long history of Buddhism, Bhakti tradition to modern constitutions? Is that a doable exercise? Because these are obviously running into very different registers. Is it a very doable exercise to bring certain spirituality and certain modern legal constitutionalism together? If so, what does it actually mean for practical purposes? My last point would be that constitutional visions are in a crisis, partly also because we mostly are lost when we debate constitutions. We're mostly lost in the operative logic of constitution. Constitutional vision and constitutional law, and this is also a question for Banerjee, should not be reduced to certain technical exercise. Often in the lawmaking process, and I see in law schools, that we reduce it to certain technical details. And in the process, we lose debating the spirit of the constitution. How do we bring back the focus to the spirit of the constitution and to this idea of social revolution of our times? I think is a big question for me, and therefore this should be a good beginning, Banerjee, to bring back some of these concepts of how to wriggle out of this deep constitutional crisis that we have entered. And there's no doubt in my mind that there is a certain kind of a rejectionism that constitutional imaginations are going all over the world, and more so in Indian context. But if we understand the nature of the crisis, that why two ends of the spectrum, both the social elites and the underprivileged, both seem to be unhappy with the constitution. I think sociologically this process can be partly explained that the social elites of India, which are broadly the caste Hindus, are unhappy because constitution provides for social mobility of the underprivileged castes. That is why they are withdrawing the social contract. The underprivileged are unhappy because they feel that sufficient aspirational transformation has not been achieved at the pace as it was promised. So we are losing out at both ends. Both you have ended up with an anxious caste Hindu elite at one end of the spectrum and an unhappy and a discontented subaltern at the other end of the spectrum. And that is why both seem to be abdicating their trust in constitutionalism. How do we restore that, and how do we come out of this crisis? I think it's only by framing fresh questions before we even begin to answer it. So I thank you all once again for this wonderful opportunity. If the students have some questions, I'll be more than happy to answer. Please go ahead. You have a mic or?
Sir, thank you so much for a wonderful session. Something that ignited in me was, are we practicing against Constitution, which rather the trend is seen to be. Okay, just a second. Oh yeah. Hello sir, good morning. Sir,
introduce yourself.
yes sir, my name is Seva and I am from Social Science and Humanities Department. Are we practicing against Constitution, which rather the trend seems to be like that, and are we in the path of reframing principles in our Constitution? With that, I have another question also. That is, are we heading towards a constitutional war? Like, everybody is going to have different constitution, principles, and because we are kind of diverse in ways, diverse, and I think that is a characteristic of being Indian. And are we going to be in a constitutional war? What do you think?
Really, oxymoron, a constitutional war. No, I don't know what about war, but yes, one part you're right, Granville Austin makes a very interesting, that what was unique about Indian constitution making process, he says it was based on two principles of accommodation and consensus. That it was not a partisan process making, that there was an absolute consensus. This idea that Ambedkar draws, and Ambedkar in fact cautions us, that Constituent Assembly made constitutional provisions to a process of consensus, but he said that parliaments never run by consensus. Parliaments are always partisan. So partisan conflicts are important to kind of reflect diversity of interest in society. But the question is, democratic institutions should help us to arrive at a provisional consensus based on the deliberations, which is what parliaments are not doing today.
That's correct, sir.
Which is what parliaments are repeatedly failing. So why is that so? Can be a very complex question. It could be because of sharpening of contradictions, because lower end voices are getting sharpening and higher end voices are not willing to listen. So that diversity, constitutional imagination is not able to hold together. So which might be a good sign of democratization. I don't see the crisis of parliament as merely a crisis in institutional functioning. It could also be a welcome crisis of democratization that we have witnessed. But the point is, how do we drive it towards institutionalizing those forms? Otherwise, they can go haywire in all kinds of directions. So in that context, this old constitutional vision, is it very helpful, or should we re-signify it in certain ways because constitutions can be made attractive again? I don't know. These are questions.
One more thing which I want to know from you, that is, what do you think in the strength, what do you believe in the strength of youth? Because populistic views are getting, or whatever is attractive, people are going towards it. But then recently the Delhi air pollution thing is going up, where students are taking initiative in protesting against the hazardous pollution, what is going on. So I would like to know from you that do you believe in the strength of the coming youth, or it's just going to be failing and to helping towards autocratic or whatever it is? Like, I'm sorry to use certain words like autocratic.
Yeah, I should ask Banerjee what he thinks about his students. Do you have any hope in these guys, or it's a hopeless case? So no, we don't get, our students are not the Gen Z, they are slightly older lot. But yes, world over, people are saying that Gen Z is the new hope. That even opposition parties today are, kind of reaching out to Gen Zs to know what happened in Sri Lanka, what happened in Bangladesh. Everywhere it is the Gen Z generation which is creating the new welcome crisis. That's a welcome crisis. So this is a very difficult generation to understand. That they are withdrawn at one end, but they also seem to be, collective in a new sense. There are new kind of collectives that are, forming. So I'm not very clear on that question. That which way will the Indian Gen Z go? Like the pollution case which you narrated, it's a very interesting case in Delhi. That it was very heartening to see Indian middle class, which is otherwise withdrawn in its gated communities, fairly indifferent. I used to always write Indian middle class is a lost cause in the Indian cause. That they're fairly withdrawn, self-oriented. They only look for their immediate comforts. That kind of a middle class suddenly jumping onto the streets is a good thing, but though again, they are jumping only because they think their kids are not breathing clean air. So how far will those? See, all democracies need some notion of fraternity, some notion of co-responsibility. Citizenship imagination is based on that sense of co-responsibility. And middle classes, globally, historically, if you look at European example, has played that role. Indian middle classes fail to play that role. So a lot will depend on Gen Z coming from these social backgrounds. Can they stretch themselves beyond to think of these larger issues? Would be an interesting case to wait and watch. But I don't have an immediate answer how it is going to behave in the near future. They're highly unpredictable lot. Energy is suffering them every day. I am happy to be aware.
Thank you, sir.
You are close by. Go ahead without my but your friends.
Sir, my question is on the colonial legacy, sir. Sir, to what extent is the Indian Constitution an indigenous document, and what extent does it remain product of its colonial heritage given its reliance on Government of India Act and the Westminster?
Yeah, so that's the point I raised, right? So there are both these versions. That if you look at the number of provisions, almost half of it was just borrowed from the Act of 1935. Look at the institutional functioning imagination, it's almost borrowed and replica, and they run. So from that end, it does look like a document that has this colonial legacy. But in its operative logic, did it make a change? By bringing in notions of liberty, equality, fraternity, idea of social revolution, land reforms, directive principles, objective resolutions. If you look, that's the transformative part of the Indian Constitution. So I think Constitution makers left it very open-ended. Because they had both these spheres. Again, as I said, it was also a war document made during partition time. Right? They also wanted security, unity of India was a big concern hanging on their heads. So that part of it led to a securitized state imagination where you have easy emergency provisions, withdrawal of fundamental rights, extraordinary laws. Then you have this transformative social justice. So there is an uneasy tension always running in Indian democracy between both these dimensions. So I think they kept constitutions by definition keep a lot of it open to the social and political process.
Hello, sir. I'm Anindita from School of Social Science and Humanities. So, it's a very interesting lecture, and I just wanted to know one thing, that when you talk about the dissociation of the spirituality, which is not reflected, quote unquote, in our constitution, and its reception in the mass, apart from the classes. So, I'm thinking about that when we look back at the reign of the King Ashoka. Ashoka actually reigned after the transformation from Chandashok to Dharmashok, and the reign of Dhamma, which is not actually related to religion. It is the righteousness, the well-being of the mass. So isn't it reflected till now when we talk about in the judiciary part, you say practically, still the word, the court is called Dharmadhikara. And also in I remember very old films, Hindi films, where we saw the court picture, the scenery there, and the lawyers speaking to Dharmavatar. So isn't it the reflection to some kind of spirituality, which is not related to religion in the terms of practice, but it is the righteousness which is reflected in that time, in the colonial, and before that, in the kingship or the kingdom, the welfare of the mass, the common being, and now it is, which we are talking about the democracy, and we are now in a democratic nation. So here, what do you think, sir? It is not reflected in our constitution still when these terms are running, or maybe they are not that much prominent now. But it is there, that's a key sense of this dharma or dharma, which is not at all related to any religious form. It is the righteousness, which is not reflected. What do you think, sir, is in our constitution?
I think a very interesting and valid question, but I think Rinku is better equipped to answer the details of Ashoka and Bhakti tradition. But I think it's a valid question to raise in the current context. But my caution would be that when we map history in those terms, the question that we need to ask is how much it is part of popular ethic. You might find certain reflections. The current regime also is, there's a lot of nomenclature change that is going on. Even laws, names have been changed. So bringing in those names, those nomenclatures does signify certain resonance and certain civilizational continuity. That's why they're referring to it as a civilizational state, by kind of thing. But is it part of our popular intersubjectivity? Does it guide our social ethics? Does it guide our principles of co-responsibility? So I'm not sure of this. I mean, how much does it really know those ethics exist? Because Gandhi was one who really believed it has to be a bottom-up process. Now you need to have those social ethics that can then get reflected in the state. He never believed state can instill, right? So this civilizational state discourse also brings in that communitarian social angle very strongly, which I think is a very important angle. But are these ethics really available? Because the kind of social violence we witness in this country, the nature of deeply ingrained caste prejudices, I don't know where are those notions of righteousness, those notions of co-responsibility. What has been the scale and impact of Bhakti tradition on Indian and our modes of thinking? So I'm very, very skeptical, and also whether these pre-modern practices do they have the force and the wherewithal to deal with modern complexities? The kinds of questions that Gen Z asks. I mean, do these traditional systems have those complex mechanisms to answer those questions? So I don't know, there is an appeal to that idea of spirituality, which that I can see, that I think civilizationally memories do travel that way. But in terms of their everyday concrete practices, how much of it can we leave it to those social ethics and say, look, we can be run by these social ethics that are grounded? Because I become more skeptical because right wing is so attracted to this idea. Unless they are somewhere convinced that traditional systems will buttress a very hierarchical imagination. To imagine that there is this spiritual transformative potential. Of course, we did have a tradition of Buddhism, Bhakti tradition, all of that one concedes. But how much is this part of popular ethics? Everyday intersubjectivity is a question that will deeply interest.
Right. So the next, the thought is coming in my mind is how can we incorporate these in not only the Gen Zs, the other also. Because as you mentioned in your lecture that the Sangathan Bachao, that movement, it didn't gain that much support or momentum. But one thing I noticed, that maybe I'm wrong, but I noticed that the people got sensitized when I'm naming the thing, like when Rahul Gandhi showing the red book in the public, in the meeting and all these things, election campaign, whatever it is. But the people is getting some sensation about that, the existence of some kind of these things, which might be not in anywhere in their imagination. So what I think that's isn't it true that a good education and education policymakers have a big role here to incorporate these things? At least we can know about that, we have something.
Again, that's a very, very difficult question. The national education policy precisely does that. It breaks down and it also gives a lot of community sensibilities. So this is also a question, how much should ethics and values be taught? They can very quickly become very totalitarian, right? If the state begins to decide ethically what is right and wrong, what is a good life and what is not a good life. The state begins to shift its focus from a just life to a good life. How liberating is that? State is good till it talks about just life, being constitutionally constrained, just procedures. What are good institutional procedures? Well, state would say, but state begins, that's what populist authoritarians do all over the world. They don't talk about the just life, they talk about a good life. What is a good way to live? So today, prime ministers, presidents are telling us, subah utke yoga karo, eat millets, AC mat chalao, tel kam khao. Now in my writings I call it the phenomenon of intimate strongmen. They're not the regular strongmen. They're very intimate. They're telling you every day. Yogi Adityanath gave a half-day press conference saying that AC should be run only at 24. Usse kam karne to sardi ho jayega. These are very attractive, paternalistic things to see in a leader. That somebody cares so much for you and your health. Prime Minister now on FM radio regularly is giving advertisements. 10% tel kam karo, obesity kam hoga, swasth badega. We ideally imagine a democratic state elected leader should say how much is investing in health system. Instead, he's telling you, yeah, health आपके हाथ में है. He's not telling I'm investing more. He's telling you, come खाओ. Health बढ़ाने के लिए. So, this is a very dangerous twist. This good life concept has a very dangerous virtuousness, has a very dangerous when it is handled by states. Because it can become highly regulated. And it is voluntaristic, this phenomenon of Atmanirbhar. So indirectly state is telling you through Kartavya and Atmanirbhar, it's your own responsibility. So tomorrow if you fall sick and you don't get good medical aid, the question is not how much medical aid is available, whether health is a public good or not. That's not the question that is being decided. The question is your lifestyle. Somebody might come and say, why did you not do yoga? Why did you take a morning class? 5 बजे उठ के योगा करो, like Banerjee does every day. So you can self-blame. So we'll all start blaming each other. You yoga नहीं किए, then it will not stop there. Then they'll ask you कितने सूर्य नमस्कार किए तुम? कौन बोला तुमको 2 करने के लिए 10 करना था? So this is a dangerous shift in the ethic dharma argument. It can quickly lead to Atmanirbhar, to self-blame, and then state gets off the hook. So these are very complex questions, but it's a relevant question. We need to open the wedge and see where do we bring that idea of the social into it. There has to be a social basis for the state working. How do we bring it? What happens to the concept of community? Community political का क्या link है? These are all relevant questions for our times.
I request Dr. Banerjee Shaka sir to felicitate our session guest, Dr. Ajay Gudavarthy.
So many shawls and talks. No, and there's no winter. Winters are disappearing. What to do with these shawls? Kanchi, but. I and Banerjee have been friends for the last 30 years.
I am Omkar on behalf of VIT School of Law. It is my distinct honor to deliver the vote of thanks. We extend our deepest gratitude to Dr. Ajay Gudavarthy sir, an eminent scholar and speaker, for his truly thought-provoking address on the critical subject, why do constitutions fail? Your analysis, Dr. Gudavarthy sir, provide us with invaluable perspectives and challenged us to consider the often complex sociological and political ideas, political realities that underlie constitutional efficacy. Your scholarship has enriched our understanding greatly. Thank you once again for sharing your time and profound expertise with us today.
Thank you, Professor Ajay. So it was very insightful session. I hope all the students are benefited from the session. So before we start in this session, we'll have a 10 minutes break.
Associate Professor at the National Law School of India University, Bangalore. We are deeply honored to have her with us and she is going to speak on the subject of immense contemporary relevance, religion, democracy, and the law and political thought of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Dr. Lamba is an exceptional scholar whose work stands at the intersection of political theory, history of political thought, religion, secularism, and multiculturalism in India. Her academic journey spans several renowned institutions. She completed her BA Honours in Political Science from Lady Shri Ram College, followed by an MA and MPhil from the Center for Political Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. She then pursued further research at the University of Oxford and earned her PhD in Political Science from the University of Toronto. With over 13 years of teaching experience at JNU, she has guided students in contemporary political theory and both in Indian and Western political thought, while also supervising doctoral research. Her international academic engagements have taken her to prestigious universities across Europe, North America, and Australia, including Humboldt University, University of Würzburg, University of Toronto, University of Sydney, and Goethe University, Frankfurt. She has also been a Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute and the Lansdowne Visiting Scholar in Religious Studies at the University of Victoria. Dr. Lamba's research contributions are both rich and wide-ranging. She works extensively on state power, secularism, multiculturalism, and conceptions of religion in India, along with the political thought of seminal figures such as Justice Ranade, Jyotiba Phule, M.K. Gandhi, and Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Her scholarship is known for bridging historical insight with contemporary political questions, making her an ideal speaker for today's theme. As we all gather here, Dr. Lamba's expertise promises to offer deep and thought-provoking perspectives. So friends, join me in inviting her to the dais.
Thank you, Pomaja, for that very warm welcome and introduction. And thanks to Dr. Banerjee and to Dr. Deepanjan for enabling me to join all of you on Constitution Day here. And I will be speaking about Ambedkar on the themes of religion, law, and democracy as they arise in his political thought. There were things that Ajay said in his wonderful endowment lecture that he gave us a short while ago, which prompted me to reorganize the way in which I wanted to talk about Ambedkar and religion and law and democracy. And also particularly the last question that came up in the Q&A in the previous session. I don't know if the person is here, but there was a very good question about what do we do with some civilizational heritage that may be recalling themes of righteousness. So I want to pitch this presentation, which I will make in a few parts, and I will try to pause after a few things that I say to ask if there are any comments or questions as I go along. So I want to say that Ambedkar is someone we understand has played a very prominent role in authoring the Indian Constitution. Ambedkar is someone who's understood to be like Nehru, quite modernist in his approach to the way in which politics must be done or can be done through the state. In that sense, he's quite different. He seemed to be different from, say, Gandhi and Tagore, who were not always keen on giving the state the kind of central agency that it enjoys in India today. And at the same time, I want to argue today in what I will say by bringing in various things together. So it's going to be like a patchwork quilt. Imagine that. I'm going to say a few things that seem disconnected, but I would like to connect them to say two things. First, that there is a tension in Ambedkar's political thought on the question of religion. On the one hand, he seems to think that some religions, such as the way in which he understood Hinduism to be, a kind of rule-based religion which allowed caste to become a habit of mind, a state of mind where you felt you were just following the rule that the religion mandated. There's, on the one hand, a criticism of something called the religion of rules, and on the other hand, he seems very comfortable with something called a religion of principles. He thinks, for example, that Buddhism might be a religion of principles. He's also open, and he's also in the annihilation of caste, he says, Brahmaism is okay, not Brahminism. He's okay with some Upanishadic understandings of what it means to be a self, etc. So there's this two-sided approach to religion, I would say, in Ambedkar, and it's most clearly there in the distinction he himself offers in the Annihilation of Caste, which is a lecture he was supposed to give to the Jat Path Todak Mandal. And that lecture was cancelled when those people came to know that Ambedkar is going to speak about the problem of caste and the way in which Hinduism, as Ambedkar understood it, actually allows a certain caste mentality to thrive. So in that text called The Annihilation of Caste, which is easily available online, you should read it when you can. It's a long document, but a very rich one with lots of interesting things, including Ambedkar's hesitation to give equality an important place, because he says we don't know what equality requires, and at the same time his reluctance to say that you can ever give it up as some kind of a guiding principle. So very, very interesting insights into the difficulty of the value of equality. Equality of what? At which point? Starting point? At starting point, what kind of equality? Among what? Differently placed individuals. So the perplexities, this is just one part of what's happening in the Annihilation of Caste. And I'm picking up on some of the things he says with respect to religion and this twofold understanding, the religion of rules on the one hand, which he wants to do away with, and in an extreme case, he even recommends that the state should reform such a religion. And I think that is part of the intellectual history of Article 25, which social sciences students and law students should be aware of. It's the provision that allows the Indian state to reform Hindu law in the direction of freedom and equality. Right? So once again, I said I want to do two things, two claims that I want to make. The first is say that there's a tension in his thought. And the second thing that I want to say is that this tension in Ambedkar's thought, the pull between saying yes to a religion of rules, no to a religion of rules, but yes to what he calls a religion of principles, a religion which allows you to think and take responsibility for what you do instead of making you do things mechanically. So that, what does he say? Is he doing cherry picking, picking up good things and saying that would be religion of principles, the things that we don't like, we call it religion of rules? Is it as simple as that? Is that what's going on in Ambedkar's distinction between religion of rules and religion of principles? Is it bad religion versus good religion? Or is it something else? I want to say it's something else. What I want to say is that Ambedkar's understanding of religion of principles is better understood by placing his thought in a longer durée understanding of this thing called religion on the Indian subcontinent. It's not enough to just think about 100 or 200 years around the time in which Ambedkar wrote, but a longer narrative about what Rajiv Bhargava would call non-religion in the Indian context. Something that the colleague who asked a question at the very end of the previous session was also gesturing toward, this thing called righteousness in the name of dharma or dhamma, to which we also know there have been appeals in the past, and to which Ajay rightly warned us. There are very quick appeals for politically questionable reasons to say that there was something grand going on in the civilization and we want to bring that back rather than have either Western or colonial understandings of how to organize our society. So what I'm trying to say, the second thing that I want to say is that this tension between religion of principles and religion of rules in Ambedkar's thought is better understood not as a tension, but as an invitation for us to reconsider what we mean by the term religion in contexts like India even today. And what do I want to say? I'm borrowing from the work of Sudipto Kaviraj and Rajiv Bhargav, and also Bimal Matilal, whose books are great fun to read. Matilal has a lot of nice books, but there's one called Ethics and Epics. There are short chapters there on the meaning of dharma as per practices in the past. What is the meaning of the idea of God in the Indian context? And he recalls, for example, Matilal, the way in which Krishna dies in the Mahabharata. Right? He dies, he's cursed by Gandhari to die alone with no one around him, and all his kinspersons would be also gone. Right? And so Matilal just asks, what is God in the Indian context? And how could God just be like, how could God have to, in that incarnation, go away in that way? Are gods, so this whole question of what is God, what is the connection between God and our understanding of what is a religion, this is something that we need to put some thought into. And I think Ambedkar's political perspective gives us a sight through which we can examine some of these older iterations of what it means to be righteous and how those meanings have gotten translated into what we today call religion and what Ambedkar would call religion principles. So are these 2 points making a bit of sense in terms of the aims of what I want to say? I want to say a little bit more about the 2 kinds of religion in Ambedkar's thought, and then I'm going to say a lot more about how I'm going to try and let you consider along with me, and we'll see what questions come up if we do this exercise together to see, can we place Ambedkar's musings on the religion of principles in a broader, in a longer story about the civilization over here, which has its high points and its lows. So I want to say something again which connects, before I proceed to elaborate on these 2 claims that I want to make, connecting back to what Ajay spoke with us about in the previous session. We cannot claim that what happened in the past was great and must be repeated just because it happened over here. So the past is something we should know a little bit more about. It's great if there were, if we were great then, the question arises, so what for now? How does that greatness reflect upon us now? What does it mean to be great in the first place? And the second is a little bit more detailed knowledge on what was going on in the past. What is it that was happening in the past? Which past? It's a very long past. So we cannot know everything about it, partly because there are no manuscripts available for some of those portions, but there are oral histories and there are ways in which scholars who are doing systematic historical studies have been able to recount something about what was going on in the long past as well. Among politics scholars, Rajiv Bhargav and Sudipto Kaviraj are at the forefront of not digging up the past, but throwing some light on the past through careful studies of whatever materials and manuscripts and edicts they have been able to find for themselves. So I'm again going to draw on all of that to say that we could be in a position to speculate about civilizational norms as some worthwhile norms that are speaking from there. They're not to be adopted just because they existed here, but there were norms, and it seems from the work of these scholars and also historians like Muzaffar Alam that the norms that I'm going to talk about that exist in this space of discussions of what is the right thing to do, something similar kept getting reiterated after a few centuries again and again. So there seems to be a cluster of norms that appear to enjoy some kind of currency over time, and those norms shed light on things that we today can shed light on things that we today call religion. So once again then, what's the point? What's the thing that I want to elaborate? I just want to say that if we want to engage claims about the past, about things that are being said that India was like this, then India is the new category. By the way, we all know that, right? It came into being only in the 19th century. There was no such thing called India before that. But if we want to say that on the subcontinent there were some interesting practices and norms, we should be able to tell each other a little bit about this is what it seems. These are the contradictory positions about that. There's a debate about this, and that's the way in which we can approach it, so that we can use concepts in the present in a more meaningful way, which is we want to be non-colonial, we want to be decolonial, we want to have norms that are Swarajist. These are very healthy ambitions for any jurisdiction. Nobody would combat that. But how are we trying to enforce that decoloniality? What concepts should we start to unravel? I think that's what came up not only from Ajay's lecture, but that wonderful question that Ajay's lecture prompted, which is what do we do with this old story of righteousness that's lingering on there? So just one quick response also on these kinds of norms, if they existed in the past, they may not have popular resonance, but that's not a problem for the norm. Right? The job here is not to say, oh, we should all be following it. The job here is even prior to that, which is what was that norm? Was there a norm? Is there something of interest in the past that we want to shed light on? Not so that we popularize it. Maybe it's popular. Someone may say, look at the popularity of Kabir on the subcontinent. If there are Kabir bands, Kabir is sung, recited by not one group, but various kinds of groups. And that's an old voice that is also talking about righteousness and about freedom from certain kinds of religion to be able to ask certain questions about what it means to be a human. And he's writing in the 16th century or 15th century, 15th, 16th century. The dates are not certain. So these resonances don't have to be there. They may be there, but our task as academics and your task as budding scholars of the social sciences or of the law is to ask questions. Was there something? What can I read about it? What systematic materials can I organize to figure something clear about this claim about being decolonial? So that's the spirit in which what I'm going to say further is drawing on. Is there any questions or anything up to now? Anything that someone wants to say? Okay. In that case, I will proceed to the next section after answering my iPad, which is asking whether I want to use the internet. So there are three parts. You want to say something? Yeah, quickly. Go ahead. You can sit and talk. That's fine.
Ambassador argued that caste is sustained by religion of rules.
Yes.
What extent the state has the power to intervene in religious affairs?
Thank you for that question. Just in case you couldn't hear it at the back. Your name is?
Jishnu, ma'am.
Jishnu?
Jishnu.
Vishnu.
Jishnu, ma'am.
Yeah, Jishnu just asked the following question. Ambedkar appears to have had a problem with a religion of rules. Did he entrust the state with any role with regard to doing something to a religion of rules? That's the question. That's a great question because that is what I want to start talking about in the first part of my elaboration. It's drawing on the annihilation of caste. That's the text from which I'll be drawing on to answer this question, but it fits very well with the way in which I was planning to go ahead. What is the most important freedom that Ambedkar values in this text if we read the annihilation of caste? And the answer I get from there, and I would be able to defend it textually as well, is the freedom to be able to bring about change in your environment. The freedom to bring about reform. What is this freedom? It's a kind of, and why is it important? It's important because change, he says, is a sign of human beings in their dynamic condition. There will be an attempt to change things as they are. And Ambedkar is concerned that there are many forms of life in India, but everywhere else in the world as well, where people are made to live within their groups and are asked to follow the rules of the group and never to change them. And if they try to reform or change those, they are actually thrown out of the group or something severe is done with them. The cost of being an individual who wants to change things and influence fellow group members is very high in some places. And for Ambedkar, that's a major problem. It leads him quickly to start saying a few other things in the annihilation of caste itself. He says that, there are going to be groups in every society. So, we hear a lot about how modern Indian thought has no place for individual liberty and individual rights. It's all about communities and groups, which is not untrue because our constitution is amongst the few in the world which has entrenched group rights for minorities for very good reason. But where is this thinking on groups coming from? Longer standing notions, I suppose, of practice, which are sustained only through interaction among people, not just belief is not just a mind state, it's also an expression, so on and so forth. And Ambedkar is not hostile to the presence of groups in any society. He says every society will have groups. In fact, he says a person can't live alone. Individuals cannot live alone, and that's why when their groups try to prevent them from changing, they don't resist the group. They stay on because they don't want to be isolated. This is not a claim he elaborates further in the annihilation of caste, but he does presuppose that individuals are not solipsistic beings, that there are groups and there are different groups in any society. He's quite a pluralist in that sense. But Ambedkar has a problem with groups which prevent their members from talking to other group members, or with groups whose members don't allow some of their other members to make changes in norms. Intra-group domination bothered him quite a bit. And he thought that in our country, and you can say sometimes that he has a very Orientalist understanding of religion and religions on the subcontinent. Ambedkar can be asked to explain a little bit about the way in which he sees Hinduism, for example, as a very fixed category. Even though in the same annihilation of caste, he's able to say that Brahmaism. What is Brahmaism? It's connected to I am that, Soham, that tradition in the Upanishads. Yes, that is okay for him. Guru Nanak is okay for him. Kabir is okay for him. And of course, Hinduism is not something that always existed. This is also something that's a modern category. The word Hindu, we know, comes from the way in which those living beyond the river Sindhu were called Hindu because of the way in which the S was pronounced by those who called the people who lived here as people who lived in Hindustan. So Hindu as a category is coming up at a time when a notion of religion as a tightly bound community that can be traced to the presence of one true God and one major text. This is also called the monotheistic idea of religion. That becomes something that enters Indian imaginaries along with the movement of Christianity into the subcontinent, not from 50 to 80, but in its missionary form with colonialism. And so I've kind of gone sideways a bit, but I'm going to come back to track very quickly as well. What I was trying to say is that according to Ambedkar, Hinduism is this rigid religion, which is Shastra oriented. And people follow the Shastra. And I was saying that he could be accused of some kind of Orientalist assumptions, sharing some Orientalist assumptions about religions being this very tightly specified group with fixed rules that come from scriptures which everyone is following. And he thinks and what I was also saying is that Hinduism is a new phenomenon. Hinduism is not an old religion. There's Vedic religion, there's pre-Vedic religion, Jaina religion, for example, and then there's the Buddhist critique of the Vedic religion, then there's the Upanishadic critique of the Vedic religion as well, and then there are other traditions such as Bhakti, which is not to be called a movement according to many scholars, but a network of a certain way of expressing faith, all of which were never consolidated necessarily under one religious name called Hinduism as such, right? So what I was just saying is that Ambedkar thinks that Hinduism in his time represents a fixed kind of space which gives rules to its adherents about how they should live, and those rules include following caste-based distinctions. And so, according to Ambedkar, there could be no such thing as a Hindu nation or a Hindu society, because both nation and society require like-mindedness within the group as well. Whereas the group that is called Hindu is divided among different castes, and no caste is interested in allying with any other caste. It is in fact interested in keeping the caste below it, always below it. It's a system of a graded system of sovereignty, as he called it. Right? And this is just rule-bound behavior. Ambedkar thought Sikhism and Buddhism and Christianity are free from caste. He didn't say that there wasn't caste even there in some way. As you will note, no ruler on the subcontinent up to the modern period ever tried to reform the caste order of Indian society. This is one of Sudipto Kaviraj's observations about the pre-modern state. Whether it was Ashoka or whether it was kings who ruled according to what the Manusmriti and the notion of Danda would have demanded, or the Mughals and their enlightened rule even under Akbar, nobody touched the social order. Religion was something around which a lot of movement occurred, and there was restraint shown by various rulers. But the social order itself didn't change. And according to Ambedkar, it would not change among these people called Hindus today because their religion sanctions it. It's a religion of rules. And this religion of rules for Ambedkar is a problem not just because it's not a great idea to follow a mechanical way of doing things, but because it came in the way of any society being able to change. It came in the way of creating a society in which people would have the freedom within their groups to change. But there is no impulse for change in a rule-based order of the kind that Ambedkar associates with what he calls Hinduism. And he makes further claims in the Annihilation of Caste. He says that in any country, in any jurisdiction, you would expect the so-called intellectuals to lead opinion and bring about change. But he says that in the Indian context, there is no incentive for the intellectuals to do that because the so-called intellectual class itself benefits from these caste rules. So he says that given the difficulty of alliances among people within caste order, and given the absence of an intellectual class that can lead us towards something that's more in the direction of right relations among persons, that is Ambedkar's term, and that's the way he defined Dhamma. Dhamma is about right relations among persons. And what are right relations? He says they are relations of reverence that persons have toward one another. So Ambedkar says that Hinduism is a religion of rules, and it has within it a kind of system which is thwarting the individual capacity to ask for change. It is thwarting liberty of various kinds, including the freedom to just be and think as you wish to. And this religion is not going to be able to change itself internally. So the law has to reform it. So yes, he mandates state involvement, not just in the abolition of caste practices such as that of treating some persons as untouchables, but also saying that the priests of temples should be appointed by the state. They should not be hereditary appointments based on where someone was born with the assumption that birth determines worth. So in that sense in which he's very secular. That's the sense in which he's secular, in the sense where you separate religion from the way in which we understand ourselves as political beings with freedom and equality, etc., for the sake of those values of freedom and equality. But there is, and that's moving now tracks a bit, there's a lot of interesting material in the Annihilation of Caste that I will not show here through PowerPoint or anything, but urge you to read his definition of what it means to be a society is to be like-minded. Like-minded is not to have the same things or to celebrate the same festivals. It's the ability to see that there are some things that matter to us as of common concern. This commonness was very important for Ambedkar across groups. Within groups, there should be a possibility to change group practices, but across groups too, there should be intermarriage, dining, there should be exchange of ideas. He borrows from John Dewey, who was his teacher, who's called it endosmosis. Movement points among groups. Don't let there be groups that are isolated. You will never have like-mindedness. And like-mindedness is very important if you take democracy seriously. Because democracy is a way of being political where in spite of our many differences of very strong interests, in spite of heterogeneity, there are still moments when we imagine ourselves to be one. Sometimes we feel that when we watch a cricket match. Sometimes we feel that moment when we hear an ambulance that we have to make way for. But these are, according to Sheldon Bolin, another interesting political theorist, these are the moments at which some commonality is experienced in spite of our other very legitimate differences from one another. And I think this like-mindedness that Ambedkar is talking about is connected to this need for a sensibility of being in something common together. It's not predetermined, it's not a common good we have to follow, but we have some interest in doing things together, and that's the kind of commonness which was impeded by caste, which could only be removed through state intervention because the way in which he saw the religion which appeared to sanction this caste was not capable of internally reforming the practice. Right. So are there any questions now about religion of rules and about the place of the state? And the connection with democracy is that caste impedes democracy and its requirement of commonness by creating spheres of separation. In many ways, if you read Karl Marx, you would have read something about alienation. I don't know if you've come across this term as yet in your studies. Marx said that capitalism produces a system of production where persons are alienated from their own species, from themselves. They're separated even from one another. In many ways, I'm not saying Tagore and Ambedkar are saying what Marx said, but a similar pathology of the modern, which is the production of a certain kind of separation among persons. And Ambedkar was worried about the separation that caste creates, which comes in the way of like-mindedness. And so religion of rules is problematic. But that brings us to something else, which is this whole space in Ambedkar's writing, which I would like to read out about a little bit. And it's as follows. So I want to say that there's a puzzle that's present in Ambedkar's thought, and it has to do with his appreciation of religions of principles. That means some religions were okay. In fact, in the Annihilation of Caste, he has sections towards the end where he says that you can't have a society without religion. Religion can hold people together. So how do we cherry pick between one kind of religion or another? That's the question we would have to ask Ambedkar. If we want democracy, which kind of religion can we be picking? So how do we address this apparent twofold understanding of religion? And I'm going to deepen that puzzle a little bit by saying something else, that for Ambedkar, democracy, which the state could enable by reforming religions of rules, should not lead to the misunderstanding that law itself can enable morality. And there are quotations, and there's a wonderful new book on Ambedkar by Ashok Gopal. It's called Apart. And it would be very nice for the library to have that book because it's like a compendium of his different writings and pretty good analysis as well. And Gopal's book contains quotations from Ambedkar to show very clearly that unlike our usual presupposition of Ambedkar being a statist modern thinker, he actually thought there were limits to what the rule of law could do. The state could not make you moral beings. In some ways, why are constitutions in crisis, or why is constitutionalism in crisis? Ambedkar would say it's because of the disposition of people who are in that system itself, which is more important than the law. So the law, he says, cannot enable moral conduct. You have to depend on something else. And that for him was religion. And therefore his interest in Sudhamma, and he chose Buddhism. He wrote about it in a book called The Buddha and His Dharma, which is an unfinished manuscript, but you should read it just to get a sense of the way in which he, I think, is translating a lot of Buddhist resources for modern times to show what are genuinely reasonable equality and freedom related aspects of even the older Buddhism that we understand as Buddhism today, even without Ambedkar. So when I said I'm going to complicate this puzzle a little bit more, it's not just religion of rules versus religion of principles. It's also the idea that the state and law are not enough for moral life. you need to have some dependence on this thing called, he calls it Sudhamma, good Dhamma, which is important. And I'm trying to see if I have a quotation. Yeah, I'm going to quote from Ambedkar. Society must have either the sanction of law or the sanction of morality to hold it together. So up to now, when we were thinking of religion of rules and everything else, the law had to come in to restore morality in some ways. Right? That was the instrumental importance of the state. And he's now saying that society must have the sanction of law or the sanction of morality if you want to hold it together. Without law or morality, society is sure to go to pieces. Of course, Ambedkar is imagining that we all want to live in society, we want to live together. In all societies, he continues, law plays a very small part. It is intended to keep the minority within the range of social discipline. These are his words. That the law plays a very small part and it's intended to keep the minority within the range of social discipline. The majority is left out and has to be left to sustain its social life by the postulates and sanction of morality. So law is only to restrain some who might be seen as doing things which offend what the majority wants to be done. There's no claim here that the majority is the rich or the educated. It's just that if someone's interfering with social cooperation, the law brings them to the right side. But the majority who are doing things for social cooperation, they are not the concern of the law. They have to sustain themselves through postulates of morality. And that's when Ambedkar says, religion in the sense of morality must therefore remain the governing principle in every society. And that's very curious for someone who's otherwise critical of these kinds of religions or rules, etc. Where do we find these religions and principles? Who's going to determine what is the religion and principles? But that's not the direction in which I want to take this further. What I want to say instead is that it might be more helpful to just ask another question, which is it the case that by religion of principles, Ambedkar is referring to a longer standing understanding of the importance of morality in human life, which was understood at some point through a notion of marga, the way of life, which was understood at other times through forms of restraint that we had to follow with respect to one another's different faith. And I'm actually speeding up quite a bit here compared to what I thought I would do. I thought I would spell these out a little bit more, and I think I will spell it out. So the question that I think we can ask for this puzzle is, can we just replace religion of principles with something like Dhamma or Dharma in its sense of righteousness as it goes back? And is it connected to what people like Kabir may have been doing, or what thinkers like Gandhi were also trying to revive as what the meaning of religion is? And my sense is yes. And why do I'm going to try and bolster the case for seeing this as the way to recognize the difference in the terminologies of religion of rules and religion of principles. And I'm going to just draw on the work of Rajiv Bhargav, who makes a very interesting claim in his latest book called Reimagining Secularism. It's a very slim book, 2023, which you should consider reading because he makes a very interesting claim. He says that there was no religion in India up to at least almost near the colonial period or just before. The idea of the term religion has no determinate cognate in social practice. He says instead, it's better to describe the Vedic period, the Jaina period before that, the Buddhist period after that, the Upanishadic period after that, the other forms of faith and margas that came up as non-religion. So he's saying that there was a preoccupation with what it meant to be ethical, but those preoccupations cannot be properly understood through the term religion. Instead, let's call it non-religion. What is it? It is non-religion. What is religion according to Bhargav? It is this idea that it's the monotheistic idea that there is in any system only one true God And there's only one true scripture as well within that order. And anyone who disagrees with that, either from inside or outside, the insider is as much an object of concern, is treated with some kind of existential fear. And so there's a very different way in which now these groups, which are also preoccupied with ethical questions, begin to place themselves as holders of the truth. They know the one true God. If you don't follow that idea, then you should be ready to face some music of a not very good variety. So this is religion, this idea that it's reducible to a claim about one true God. And there are very interesting things Bhargav says, and I'm only going to just give you one or two snippets. Have you heard of the term Harihara? What is Harihara? Yeah, there are two gods. And Shiva is not an incarnation of Vishnu. Right? If it was Krishna, Vishnu, we would understand it's the same. But these are two, Shaivite and Vaishnavite, very different. They even put their differently. Right? There were disagreements among those groups. And they were resolved by deciding to have different symbols for the way in which they smear the ash on their foreheads. It's not to say that there were not disagreements about who is God, what does it mean to be faithful on the subcontinent, but there were ways through which you could have one God whose name was Harihar. And there's not just one true God. This God could be a hyphenated identity. What is the point of all this? It is just to say that the prehistory of things to do with faith and worship on the subcontinent was going on side by side with the question of what does it mean to lead a moral life. It was never fused as there is only one God and you can do the right thing in only one way. That is the much more recent phenomenon which leads in the direction of things that Ambedkar would call, or things like what Ambedkar would call religion of rules, where you're bound to do something in a particular way. The rest, according to Bhargav, falls in the realm of non-religion. And what I wanted to stop this with and leave you with, when I said that there would be, how do I resolve this puzzle? I would simply say that maybe we should think of Ambedkar and his distinction between religion of rules and religion of principles as allowing us to notice the way in which some older notions of non-religion continue to occupy important minds even in the last 100 years with respect to how to live morally. So I think instead of saying, oh, there's something confusing in his way of looking at religion, I would say that he invites us to reconsider what does religion stand for? What all is it meant to capture from a very long past? Even though it's a very recent concept on the subcontinent, it is a concept that became popular after colonialism, when there was a competition to become like Protestantism, Brahmo Samaj, for example, one God, no superstition, and the monotheistic pull begins to grow and defining yourself clearly in terms of a book and one God. And there are many gods, but we know that there are some gods who are being valorized as the God of a tradition. These are new moments. These are the things that are more connected to communalism. Religion, Bhargav would argue, is the thing that enables communalism because by its nature, it is going to see any other religion as an existential threat. This new kind of religion, right? This one God, one book, correct understanding. And Ambedkar's calling for a religion of principles, or even Gandhi's call when he says that I don't want to mix religion with politics, but I can't imagine doing my politics without religion. Which religion are they talking about? Certainly, we have to think, what are they referring to? What all have we gone and pushed into the concept of religion? Can we retrieve something from there at a time when in the name of religion there's an attempt to actually push more in the direction of a rules-oriented way of doing things? So if you're interested in democracy and in the law to restore the possibility of treating one another with reverence, Ambedkar would say that's not enough, even though he seemed to have said mostly that, but there's a lot in his writing which I think makes him much closer to Gandhi and Tagore than we usually see. He's not just the statist, law-governed order thinker. He's someone who takes conduct and disposition of human beings very seriously because that's the cement through which you can sustain an order in which you can have relations of reverence with one another, which matter to persons should just live like that with one another. That's what Dhamma requires, he says. And so I'll stop with that. And if there are questions, I'm very happy to engage. Yes.
I'm Professor Raju. I'm from Tamil. I will just interesting lecture from you. I was thinking about you said Ambedkar said we need religion as a kind of moral code of conduct guides.
Yes.
But what about Marx, like who said religion is false consciousness? So those who
Yes.
think religion in terms of false consciousness, how do they think? What are these insights from Buddha and Marx, Ambedkar's work on Buddha and Marx? Please elaborate.
Thanks. Okay. So I'm going to pose this question to Ambedkar. What would he say to Marx, to Karl Marx's claim that religion is false consciousness? And Ambedkar would say that religion, if it is morality, cannot be false consciousness. Why can it not be false consciousness? So Ambedkar would, to my mind, he would then participate with a longer trajectory on the subcontinent on this question, which is simplified for us by Bimal Matilal, who says that Indic religions don't have necessarily a notion of God. Buddhism doesn't have any notion of God in it. Right? So part of Marxist critique comes from this idea that there's a notion of we alienate ourselves to this thing called God, which is perfect, and religion is still God-centered in that sense. And Matilal lets us know, and my argument is that Ambedkar, through religion of principles and morality, belongs in this thing that Matilal is describing, which is that firstly, there's no need for a God, and second, Matilal argues, he's a philosopher who has studied Indian traditions quite well, and you will really enjoy, as I said, that book called Ethics and Ethics, short chapters, very interesting chapters on various aspects of terms that we hear all the time, including in movies, dharma, and so on and so forth. He says that he basically makes a very interesting claim, which is Marx would say the same about morality, that it's false consciousness, that it's bourgeois morality, right? So Marx would have a problem with any of these norms because for him they come from some class origin. Of course, there are norms in a communist order, and those norms come when there's no longer any class and activism. Right? That's when people are going to really be genuinely free because they're going to be economically somewhat equal. So there's a sense that there are morals in Marxism as well, but most of the time there is no talk about what those morals will be. There's much more an interest in Marx to show that the existing system of morality is to benefit the ruling class. Right? So while I'm not saying that the Marxist project is amoral, Marx didn't have much to say about morals in general, except that they are class sham. Right? There's class. So Matilal, on the other hand, who I think Ambedkar could stand with in responding to such a question, would simply say the following, that religion doesn't determine morality. Certainly not the case with many Indian religions, and he's happy to extend it to all other religions as well, because he says actually all religions can be seen to be standing on common moral ground, but interpreting those morals differently. So morality is not that which my religion demands, but my religion itself is standing on some moral ground. And Matilal just gives you, he says it's common to most religions that there are certain things you will not do to people. And he's claiming that that ground is what many Indic religions can be standing on. It's not God, it's more the absence of dukkha. To get rid of suffering. What should persons do to get rid of suffering? Matilal says it's about deconditioning your life from the things that cause you misery. And most of these paths have ways to tell you how to get deconditioned in that sense. So that's this, I think that's it's not replying directly to the question of, what did Ambedkar say, Buddha and Marx, but it's replying to the most substantive question that for Ambedkar, cement is morality. How do we relate with one another? What cements my behavior? Is it moral or is it religion of rules? And Marx is saying morality is always in the interest of some, whereas these notions of moral are not saying that they're in anyone's interest. This is what the right demands. These are some things there are things we ought not do to one another. And religions stand on that ground and interpret those oughts differently. So that's just the beginning of a response, not a fulsome enough one, but some. Yes, please.
Hello, ma'am. Ma'am, I have a couple of questions which just invited me to ponder upon while you giving the enlightening speech. The thing is, ma'am, the religion, God, or I would say God, like not religion. Religion, I feel that Ambedkar is referring the term religion as a little political side.
Okay.
It's not because when you quote Ambedkar that religion or politics,
Gandhi.
Sorry, yeah,
Yes.
Gandhi, politics and religion, we need to keep it separately. But then Ambedkar is referring the term religion as part of terminology. Do you think so? That's one question. And God and democracy. Second question: then God and democracy, are they still in the same line in the contemporary, times? Like God and democracy, are they in the parallel lines in the contemporary situation?
Okay, so two questions. Right? The first is there something, does Ambedkar's understanding of religion involve the political?
Yes.
That's the first question.
Yes.
The second one is, in contemporary times, are God
and democracy
are they competing with each other?
No, are they still in the same line? Because when Ambedkar talks,
are they still in the same line as?
Like, can they go parallelly in the contemporary situation?
Okay.
And the third one is the three strata of society, that is religion, politics, economic, or capitalism. When we come, when we say, when we take Karl Marx or Ambedkar, so religion, politics, and capital coming together in the contemporary situation into a privatization of power in the contemporary society of India. Yeah, that's what I would like to know. 3 questions.
All right. Okay. So the first one, so the second one was, can God and democracy exist together?
Yes.
So the third one is, what are my reflections on the way in which religion, politics, and capital are coming together to privatize power? And the first one was?
Is Ambedkar the term?
Is there something put? Okay. Thank you. So all very rich questions. The third one is really asking me for my view, and I'm glad it comes at the last. So the first one is a very rich question. Did his reflections on religion have anything to do with the realm of the political? I feel personally, and I would argue about this, and I've begun arguing about it in my writing at least. There's this usual idea that Ambedkar is more interested in the social domain than in the political. He made a distinction between social and political, and that he said that democracy will not sustain in India till our habits change. The social is the more important place, where we assume the political to be the state, right? That the state will not change our habits and so on and so forth. It's we who have to, at our level, do something. So your question helps us to see that Ambedkar is not talking about such a division in any trivial sense, because there is, of course, politics in the social realm as well. What does it mean to do politics? Politics is a competition for power. What is the political? It's a vision we have when we are in those fleeting moments of commonality about what we would like to do together. And politics is the more general competition we have for state power in modern times. So for Ambedkar, interestingly, very much like Judith Shklar, whose work on liberalism you should read as lawyers and as social science students. Urgent reading. Judith Shklar says something that I think Ambedkar would wholeheartedly agree with, that government is both formal and informal. The only government we need to worry about is not the state. Caste governs us as well. and so does patriarchy. So government can exist not just in the state, and our political battles are pitched at both the formal and the informal sides of government. In that sense, to the extent that religions of rules are impeding the personal liberty of some and causing some to be at the mercy of others, then there's a very clear reason to allow political consideration of those practices. In general, liberal politics is not worried about traditions, but if those traditions are impeding liberty, then politics has something to say about them. In the same way, Ambedkar's conception of religion, of rules particularly, as well as religion of principles, these are both politically oriented tasks. Some of them require the use of force to put down one kind of way of doing things, and the other, the use of force in the way Ambedkar understands the importance of non-violence and violence. He very short essay by Dewey on what is non-violence and whether force is also a form of violence. Ambedkar basically echoes that kind of this kind of range between extreme coercion and the use of force. And like Dewey, he says, I'm not a votary of non-violence, but I'm not just allowing violence to be used as a means whenever. Right? So some force has to be used, and so the use of force is what is politics. We use some coercive method to get ourselves to see things differently by political means, which can be formal and informal. They're not just statist. So I don't know if I addressed the question directly, but here's the indirect response, which is that if to be political means to reshape values with the use of even persuasive force, not just violent force, then religion is something on which politics will have to be done when it is in the direction of preventing change and allowing personality to flourish. Again, a term that he uses from Dewey Ambedkar. Personality should be free to develop. I should be able to choose any occupation I want. I should not be tethered to the one my group thinks I should be doing, for instance. The second question was about, can God and democracy exist? Yeah, that's the argument that people would make for the Western model. That God is now a matter of choice. Belief in God is now not the default position in the modern West, which is disenchanted, which has separated God from the way in which the universe conducts its affairs. And democracy is a very important, self-government is a very important modern idea. Right? So faith is not something that the state will force. The state can allow it. And you can have a range of democratic secular regimes that allow or disallow some amounts of religion or no religion. But if your question was in that direction, and that's how I would respond to it, that they are consistent. What about in a context like ours, where, as Sudipto Kaviraj said, we've not really reached disenchantment. You will at some point read Max Weber, who made this very famous comment that we now live in a disenchanted world. What is a disenchanted world? Basically means that when the crow comes and caws at my doorstep in the morning, it's not an evil omen. It's just the bird that's making a sound. If there's an earthquake, it's not because humankind has done some sin. When nature is seen to speak to us, then there was a porosity between nature and us. In a disenchanted world, nature is an object and I'm a subject, unconnected to it. There's no enchantment or magic out there anymore. There are no natural signs that I should watch out for with regard to whether I've done the right thing or not. We are now buffered selves, as Charles Taylor calls it. Right? So the question that's been raised by many is that India has not become like that. We are still in a very enchanted universe. Kaviraj says we have managed to defer the disenchantment of the modern West while becoming modern ourselves. And so your question about can God and democracy coexist? Kaviraj, you must read this essay when you get time. I will not rehearse the main points here. It's called Disenchantment Deferred. He points out the way in which for the last 3,000 to 4,000 years, there have been various points at which it was possible to enter a system in which humanism of a kind which requires no longer any faith in God could have been possible. But somehow the faith systems involved reshaped themselves in such a way to not make that choice necessary between being a humanist and a believer in signs from nature or God. So God and democracy can coexist in India as well, but in very different imaginaries from the West, but both as modern. the third question, what do I think about religion, politics, and capital? I would just echo what Ajay said when he reminded us of a certain advertisement in which we are being asked to look after ourselves. Because neoliberalism will ask us to think about things that are part of our ancient value systems as ways through which we'd be better off disciplining ourselves by our own free action and our own volition, and let the state wither more and more, and make it freer for a certain kind of exchange to take place. So very brief, but I would just refer you back to what the previous speaker reminded us of, the way in which positioning as interested in a certain religion can go hand in hand with a certain way of privatizing accountability, responsibility for things which are otherwise matters of common concern. The very thing that Ambedkar would bring back. Where is common? If you get privatized, you said privatization of power. Very interesting term. I don't know if you want to say more about that, but I will not say. But that term is quite interesting. Privatization of power to the level of individual or groups or to corporate transnational entities. So privatizing what is non-public, which is opening another wonderful area for me, which I will not start talking about, though it's a favorite. What is this public-private dichotomy as well? But I would ask you more maybe in book conversation what that means. Other thoughts or questions or comments? I'm happy to field some more. Did it make any sense to think about Ambedkar and democracy and law and religion? Did something come across? Read the text. Annihilation of Caste is really rich. It has something about democracy, it has something about religion, it has something about liberty, equality, fraternity. His definitions of those are worth reading. Short sections on all of these. They're not. So read it in parts if you can, and also the Buddha and Marx, his meditation on that. Thank you.
Hello.
Oh, yes.
Hello, ma'am. My question is regarding the misinterpretation of traditional texts.
Okay.
For instance, the word koti has dual meaning, like tides and crores as well, like 33 crore gods in Hinduism.
Yes.
So, what impact does this misunderstanding have on the beliefs and perceptions of religion?
What does it have on which? I didn't hear the.
Like 33 types of gods.
Yes.
It can mean tides as well, crores as well.
Okay.
So, it can have dual meaning, like many words. Like, how does this impact on our beliefs? Should we consider it as crores or types? Like polytheism, when it comes to polytheism?
Very good question. I'm happy to talk for a little bit more time. Can I? Yeah. So there are many parts of your question. One of them I cannot answer. Or there are many ways in which I see your question. One I cannot answer, which is the correct definition of koti? That's the question. I don't know whether it's 33 or crores. Koti I thought was crores, or like koti pranam is something that we sometimes also hear, right? Koti, or the gopis thought they saw Koti Krishna when the Ras Leela was going on. So many Krishnas, you didn't know where to look because there were so many of them. But your question is, if it is going the direction of polytheism and single godness, then there's something that I may like to have a conversation about. And this is, so polytheism is a very interesting thinker called Jan Assmann. Must read his work when you get time again, for good reasons. So Jan Assmann warns us not to think of monotheism and polytheism as opposites of each other. Monotheism is that there is the one God. Polytheism, we are used to it in our parts of the world, right? Many gods. And so we are polytheistic, we are not monotheistic. Instead, Jan Assmann says there are two ways of being monotheistic. One is an exclusionary monotheism and the other is an inclusionary monotheism. Harihara belongs in the tradition of an inclusive monotheism where your one God can be named differently. Because you understand that Saraswati is the goddess of knowledge here and there's Sophia, the goddess of wisdom in some other civilization. We see them as interchangeable, translatable entities, as Asman and following Asman Bhargava argues. These polytheisms are also very happy with the idea that there is just one God. But that one God is not fixed in name or form. You can give them any. So Gandhi is an inclusionary monotheist. One God, many paths. It's a little bit like what Matilal said. One morality, many religions. And so monotheism and polytheism are not simply opposites of one another. And we are a polytheistic system with an inclusionary monotheistic inclination, or not. Right? So how many gods? Just the number. How do we? Egyptian example is Amun and Ra, both different ways of calling the sun god. And the god is named Amun Ra. Hyphenated entities, which, Shirdi Sai Baba, whose work is now, I don't know whether that masjid still exists today. About 10 years ago, there was a lot of furor around it. You used to live in a masjid, apply ash, on the urs, you would be served biryani. A very mixed tradition. You don't know what's going on there. There's a Shiva worship going on along with us, which is associated now by us with one religion. Right? So these forms where God is still one, but is consistent with many forms. They are not wrong, these other ones. And we don't have to be worried when we see another God named older. Those are inclusionary monotheism. So I took it a little bit away from where you started with, but I remained with the numbers and I got onto the term polytheism. But I don't know what koti means. I thought it just means many, many, many. So I don't know the exact number. Growth? Growth. Koti is growth. 100 lakhs. Koti. I get to say koti koti thanks. Thank you.
Now I like to invite Banerjee sir to kindly Professor Rinkumar. Everyone present here. On behalf of the organizing committee, it is my honor to deliver the vote of thanks for the fourth session of our lecture series. I extend my sincere gratitude to our distinguished speaker, Dr. Rinku Lambama, for her enlightening address on religion, democracy, and the political thought for Dr. V.R. Ambedkar. Her deep reflections on vision, where religion is anchored in humanity, democracy is a way of life, and law becomes an instrument of social justice, have greatly enriched our understanding. I also thank the respected faculty members, organizers, and volunteers whose dedication ensured smooth conduct of this program. My appreciation extends to all the students and participants for their enthusiastic engagement, which truly reflects the democratic spirit that Ambedkar advocated. As we conclude, may we carry forward today's learning with a commitment to uphold the values of justice, equality, liberty, and fraternity in our academic and personal lives. We close with the words of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar: cultivation of mind should be the ultimate aim of human existence. Thank you. Jai Hind. A small announcement. Students are expected to be